November 6th, 1661. Not a date whispered with hope, but one etched in the annals of horror. The Queen's screams echoed not with the joy of birth, but the chilling lament of a dynasty condemned. Forget regal fanfare. This was the prelude to a requiem. Because cradled in Mariana of Austria's arms wasn't a prince, but a grotesque parody of one, Charles II of Spain, the living testament to royal inbreeding's catastrophic climax. The Habsburg jaw, once a symbol of power, now a monstrous protrusion. His eyes, vacant pools, reflecting the empire's impending doom. This wasn't merely a birth, it was the unveiling of a genetic nightmare, a monster born of ambition, and the curtain call for Spain's golden age. The whispers started immediately, horrified gasps exchanged in shadowed corners. The physicians, faces pale beneath their powdered wigs, fought to conceal their revulsion. This child, this thing, was their future king? The weight of the world, the fate of an empire spanning continents, landed squarely on his deformed shoulders, and the realization crushed them. The Queen, torn between primal maternal instinct and the chilling truth, knew. She had birthed not a savior, but a harbinger of collapse. Inbreeding, the Habsburgs' fatal flaw, had bloomed into full, putrid flower. For generations, strategic marriages had kept the blood pure, the power concentrated. But purity had become poison, strength twisted into weakness, and divine right mocked by genetic blight. Charles wasn't just deformed, he was a biological time bomb, ticking away the seconds until the empire shattered. His oversized head lolled, his limbs were pathetic reeds, and his tongue, too large for his mouth, lolled obscenely. The Habsburg jaw, a family trait, had mutated into a grotesque caricature. He was unable to chew solid food or speak anything more than garbled nonsense. News of the abomination spread like plague through the courts of Europe. Ambassadors and spies, sworn to discretion, couldn't mask their horror. They saw in the malformed prince a Spain ripe for the picking, a dynasty teetering on the brink. Forget strategic alliances, vultures were circling. This wasn't a singular tragedy, but the culmination of a twisted experiment, a centuries-long attempt to defy nature's laws, with this pitiful creature as the final, devastating result. And Mariana, despite her horror, despite the urge to recoil, was determined to protect her son, to shield him from the world's scorn, to maintain the illusion that he was fit to rule, even as the empire crumbled around them. Her devotion, tragically, would become both his sanctuary and his prison, delaying the inevitable reckoning. To understand the magnitude of this disaster, to grasp the sheer audacity of the Habsburgs' genetic gamble, you must see their rise. From cunning political maneuvering to unimaginable wealth, they were once the envy of Europe. Their fall, triggered by this one child, was all the more spectacular, all the more complete. The Habsburg saga began in 1516, when Charles I inherited the Spanish throne. He was everything his descendant was not: intelligent, charismatic, a master of strategy. Under his rule, Spain exploded in wealth and power, the conquistadors forging an empire where the sun never set. The Spanish court became the epicenter of culture and influence, dictating fashion, art, and politics. His son, Philip II, continued this legacy, ruling from the magnificent Escorial Palace, a symbol of Spanish might and Catholic orthodoxy. Their empire stretched across continents, their armies were unmatched, and their coffers overflowed with American gold. But even in this golden age, the seeds of destruction were sown. They started to marry their own relatives in an attempt to keep their territories unified under a single bloodline. At the time, it seemed like a smart idea, but as time went on, more problems rose from the marriage of close relatives. They built magnificent palaces and patronized the greatest artists, but beneath the surface was a dangerous secret. The Habsburgs were sitting on a time bomb waiting to explode. Philip II's son, Philip III, was the first to show signs of something wrong. He wasn't as bad as later generations, but he showed signs of weakness and mental instability. His reign was the start of the slow downfall of the Spanish Empire, but they were too wealthy to see it. The Habsburgs were not the only ones to practice marriage within the family, but they were obsessed with it more than anyone. Over generations, people married nieces, cousins married cousins, all in an attempt to keep their bloodline pure over genetic health. As the 17th century arrived, they were at the top of the world, unaware that they were sitting on a powder keg waiting to explode. The genetic damage would soon manifest itself in ways that would shock the world and destroy the greatest empire in history. The stage was set for Charles II, the product of this twisted experiment.
Philip III lacked the ambition and intellect of his predecessors. Preferring hunting and religious pursuits to the intricacies of statecraft, he left the empire to drift, a ship without a captain. His appearance was further proof of the issue, a more obvious Habsburg jaw, along with mysterious health issues that baffled the physicians of the time. He could not stay focused for a long period of time, a sign of issues that would only get worse in his family. During his reign, Spain started to face some military and economic problems. The Dutch revolt was a problem, along with the 30 Years' War stretching their military. The flow of gold and silver from the Americas caused inflation throughout Europe, putting Spain in a vulnerable position. His marriage to his cousin, Margaret of Austria, was a mistake that made things much worse. Many of their children died at a young age. Further damage was created. Those who survived had some impairments that were hidden from the public. Court life was starting to become disconnected from the running of the empire. Elaborate etiquette had become a way to hide the inadequacies of the royal family. Protocols were developed to allow the king to appear dignified, but limited his involvement in any decision-making. The Spanish Inquisition, meant to maintain religious orthodoxy, was now used to suppress talk about the royal family's issues. Anyone who dared to suggest that the king's issues were hereditary was at risk of heresy. This made it impossible to discuss the growing problems of the dynasty. Diplomats sent back information, but they were often ignored and chalked up to propaganda. The wealth and power of Spain were enough to ignore their concerns, but those watching close began to realize that something was not right. Each royal birth was filled with anxiety due to the potential of genetic problems. The dynasty that was once favored by God now appeared to be cursed. The reign of Philip IV was the turning point in this Habsburg genetic catastrophe. Born in 1605, Philip showed more severe signs of issues than past kings. Portraits of him carefully concealed his deformities, but records show a man struggling with physical and mental limits. Philip IV's marriage to his niece, Mariana of Austria, was one of the worst decisions that could have been made. Court genealogists, if honest, could have predicted the issues, but political reasons were more important than genetic health. The king could not produce a healthy heir, which became a closely guarded secret. Multiple pregnancies ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or death of infants with severe issues. The few who did survive showed signs of genetic issues that were horrifying. Philip IV's health degraded quickly, and his mental capacity became questionable. Diplomats reported that he was confused in meetings and struggled to understand complex political situations. His melancholy, which was immortalized in portraits, was the result of genetic depression. The Spanish Empire started its decline during Philip IV's reign. The loss of Portugal, military defeats, and economic issues showed that Spain was led by a king who could not effectively rule. Queen Mariana's multiple miscarriages and deaths of her children caused superstitious terror. They started whispering about a curse and questions about God favoring the Habsburgs. Whispers were dangerous to voice, but it revealed the awareness that something was fundamentally wrong. The birth of Margarita Teresa in 1651 gave hope, as she appeared relatively normal at birth. But her marriage to her uncle, Holy Roman Emperor, ensured that the cycle would continue. The Habsburgs were committed to genetic suicide, even when the consequences were apparent. When Prince Philip Prospero was born in 1657, physicians initially celebrated a healthy male heir. But his health quickly degraded and he died at 4, leaving the succession in doubt. His death caused desperation surrounding Queen Mariana's pregnancies and created the stage for the birth of Charles II. The pregnancy that would produce Charles II was filled with ominous signs that terrified the Spanish court. Queen Mariana, now in her 20s, was worn down by multiple failed pregnancies and her young son, and experienced complications that physicians had never seen. Her condition seemed to worsen each month, as if her body was rejecting the child. Contemporary accounts said that her pregnancy was difficult, with symptoms suggesting that the fetus was developing abnormally. Physicians were limited and could do nothing as Mariana experienced what seemed to be a dangerous pregnancy. Philip IV's health degraded quickly, and his mental capacity became questionable. Diplomats reported that he was confused in meetings and struggled to understand complex political situations. His melancholy, which was immortalized in portraits, was the result of genetic depression. The Spanish Empire started its decline during Philip IV's reign. The loss of Portugal, military defeats, and economic issues showed that Spain was led by a king who could not effectively rule. Queen Mariana's multiple miscarriages and deaths of her children caused superstitious terror. They started whispering about a curse and questions about God favoring the Habsburgs. Whispers were dangerous to voice, but it revealed the awareness that something was fundamentally wrong. The birth of Margarita Teresa in 1651 gave hope, as she appeared relatively normal at birth. But her marriage to her uncle, Holy Roman Emperor, ensured that the cycle would continue. The Habsburgs were committed to genetic suicide, even when the consequences were apparent. When Prince Philip Prospero was born in 1657, physicians initially celebrated a healthy male heir. But his health quickly degraded and he died at 4, leaving the succession in doubt. His death caused desperation surrounding Queen Mariana's pregnancies and created the stage for the birth of Charles II. The pregnancy that would produce Charles II was filled with ominous signs that terrified the Spanish court. Queen Mariana, now in her 20s, was worn down by multiple failed pregnancies and her young son and experienced complications that physicians had never seen. Her condition seemed to worsen each month, as if her body was rejecting the child. Contemporary accounts said that her pregnancy was difficult, with symptoms suggesting that the fetus was developing abnormally. Physicians were limited and could do nothing as Mariana experienced what seemed to be a dangerous pregnancy.
Her fear was real, as she sensed that this birth would be different. The royal chambers were prepared with more secrecy and security. King Philip IV was already showing signs of deterioration, insisted on religious ceremonies for a successful birth. The entire Spanish Empire was holding its breath due to the reliance on a healthy male heir. As labor began, Queen Mariana's screams echoed with a new intensity, frightening the physicians. Records suggest that the birth was traumatic and prolonged. The queen's distress was amplified by her sensing something was wrong with her child. The birth on November 6, 1661, brought not celebration but horror to the Spanish court. The infant that emerged was deformed, initially causing the physicians to question if it could survive. The Habsburg jaw was extremely protruding, not allowing the child's mouth to close properly. Queen Mariana reportedly fainted at her first look at her son. The celebration was canceled, and only the closest courtiers were allowed to see the newborn prince. The secret of Charles's condition became one of the most protected secrets in history. The infant's survival surprised everyone in the royal household. Physicians could not understand how such a severely damaged child could survive. Some saw divine intervention, while others whispered of supernatural forces keeping him alive for a terrible purpose. The court faced the challenge of announcing the birth without revealing the full extent of his deformities. Protocols were developed to limit access to the infant, and official portraits were crafted to minimize the damage. The fiction of Spain having a healthy heir would be maintained for years. The early years of Charles II's life were filled with constant medical crises. The infant could not nurse because of his jaw, needing specially designed equipment. Charles's developmental delays were apparent within months of his birth. While infants began to show responsiveness, the future king remained passive. His eyes would stare without focus, and he showed no reflexes. The queen's attempts to stimulate his development only highlighted his issues. Walking was another insurmountable challenge.
His weak limbs could not support his head, and he remained unable to stand without help. When he did achieve movement, it was an awkward stumble that needed constant supervision. Speech was the most tragic aspect of his early years. His large tongue and jaw made speech impossible, and the sounds he made were hard to understand. Queen Mariana spent hours trying to teach her son basic words, but progress was minimal. The psychological impact on Queen Mariana was devastating. She had hoped to produce an heir, but found herself caring for a child who could not normally develop. Her letters revealed a woman struggling with grief and guilt. Court life adapted around Charles's limitations, with a system to hide his condition. Special tutors were brought in to work with the prince, but they were limited. The education of a king had to be abandoned in favor of basic skills. King Philip IV's reaction reflected denial and despair. The aging king insisted that his heir was developing normally while seeking interventions. Physicians were under pressure to find treatments for issues that were untreatable. The secrecy surrounding Charles's condition caused fear and suspicion. Servants who had direct contact with the prince were sworn to secrecy, while ruses were developed to maintain the fiction for diplomats. As Charles II reached the age of education, the challenge facing Spain was undeniable. The heir to the greatest empire was incapable of learning basic skills, let alone statecraft. The dynasty was now represented by a child who could barely function.
The death of Philip IV in 1665 thrust the 4-year-old Charles II onto the throne, creating a constitutional crisis. The regency under Queen Mariana had the impossible task of running the empire while hiding the fact that their king could not function. Accounts of Charles's coronation describe a disturbing scene choreographed to hide his condition. The crown had to be specially fit for his large head, and he required support. His inability to speak the oaths meant others had to speak for him, raising questions about the legitimacy of his reign. Diplomats who had audiences with the child king returned with shocking reports about the Spanish family. The French ambassador said Charles was more animal than human, while the English representative wrote that he was afflicted with madness. These reports spread, undermining Spanish diplomatic credibility. The Regency government faced challenges in conducting administration while maintaining the fiction. Official documents required the king's signature, leading to mechanisms for guiding his hand. The entire government became a fraudulent charade. Military defeats reflected that Spain was effectively leaderless. Foreign powers recognized that Spanish weakness presented opportunities for expansion. The Spanish economy faced pressures from chaos caused by Charles's incapacity. Trade routes became less secure, colonial administration was corrupt, and the Spanish navy declined. The empire was coming apart. Religious authorities questioned if Charles's condition was punishment. The Inquisition, while supporting the monarchy, investigated supernatural causes for the king's affliction. Some suggested the family was cursed. Queen Mariana's regency became desperate as Charles failed to improve. Physicians exhausted every treatment, while spiritual advisors organized ceremonies. The queen's agony was compounded by her responsibility for maintaining authority while knowing her son could never truly rule. The nobility began to fragment as it was clear Charles would never produce an heir. Succession planning became a source of intrigue. As Charles II grew older, his condition became difficult to hide. Rumors about the king's afflictions spread, challenging the legitimacy of royal authority. The teenage years of Charles II brought new horrors as his conditions worsened. What physicians had hoped might be delays proved to be permanent deterioration. His deformities became more pronounced, while his mental capacity showed no improvement. Despite educational efforts, Charles's eating difficulties became life-threatening. His jaw made chewing impossible, forcing him to subsist on liquid diets. The king starved despite having access to the finest foods. His attempts at communication were unsuccessful. Royal proclamations had to be fabricated, creating questions about his reign. Sexual maturity caused the question if he could produce an heir. Examinations revealed severe issues that made reproduction unlikely, but this information was treated as a secret. The future of Spain depended on hope for a miracle. Charles's first marriage in 1679 was a desperate attempt to continue the Habsburg line. The French princess, Marie-Louise of Orléans, arrived unprepared for her husband's condition. Her shock was concealed, but her letters revealed her horror. The wedding was an exercise in deception, with Charles needing constant assistance. His inability to speak the vows raised questions about the union. Her attempts at a relationship with Charles proved impossible due to his limitations. Accounts suggest that consummation was impossible. The failure to produce an heir created a succession crisis. Foreign powers planned for the partition of the Spanish Empire, while factions competed for influence. The Habsburg dynasty was cursed with extinction. Her death in 1689 was accompanied by rumors of poisoning. Her death removed any hope that Charles might produce a direct heir, forcing the court to confront the reality that the Habsburg line would end with him. The search for a second wife represented a final attempt to continue the dynasty. The choice of Mariana of Nolberg reflected political reasons rather than hope. Charles's second marriage in 1690 followed the same pattern of ceremony hiding dysfunction. By this time, the king's condition had deteriorated further, and he required assistance. The new queen's attempts to fulfill her duty proved fruitless. Charles's physical condition worsened to the point that the pretense of a marriage was difficult to maintain. The court continued the charade of monitoring for pregnancy, but everyone understood that hopes were futile. Her letters revealed her frustration and despair at her husband's condition and the expectations placed upon her. She wrote about his behavior, his inability to understand, and his seizures. The Spanish court's efforts to maintain the fiction of a marriage became absurd, while foreign ambassadors reported a monarchy that had descended into theater. As Charles entered his 30s, the question of succession became dominant. Powers began negotiating treaties that would divide the Spanish Empire, treating Charles as if he were dead. The king, who should have been at the height of his power, had become irrelevant to decisions about his kingdom. The final decade of Charles II's reign witnessed the collapse of Spanish power. Military defeats accumulated. Charles's physical deterioration accelerated during his final years. Physicians documented symptoms that included seizures, paralysis, and unconsciousness. The genetic inheritance overwhelmed his body's ability to function. The king's mental state deteriorated into complete intellectual collapse. Contemporary accounts describe a man who could no longer recognize faces, respond to his name, or perform basic functions. The ruler of the world's largest empire was utterly dependent on others for utter survival. The French ambassador wrote of seeing the king drooling while being fed like an infant. These reports circulated through European courts as evidence of Spanish weakness. The Spanish court's attempts to conceal Charles's condition became futile as his symptoms could no longer be hidden. Religious authorities began discussing if Charles's condition represented punishment. The Inquisition investigated claims that the family had been cursed for defiance of natural law. Some suggested that God had withdrawn his blessing. The question of Charles's testament became crucial as European powers positioned themselves for the partition. The king's inability to understand issues meant that his will would be the product of court factions. The document that would determine the fate of the world would be written by a man who could not read it. Economic collapse accompanied political disintegration as Spain's colonial empire began to function independently. Trade routes started to break down as administrators lost confidence in orders from Madrid. The wealth that had sustained the Habsburgs dried up. The Spanish nobility's preparation for the end of the Habsburg dynasty created internal conflicts. Noble families began making separate arrangements with foreign powers. Loyalty to the crown became meaningless when the crown had lost power. As Charles II lay dying in November 1700, the scene represented one of history's tragedies. The man who had inherited the greatest empire was dying having accomplished nothing except the destruction of his family's genetic line. Physicians could only watch as nature claimed its victim. His final days were marked by symptoms that observers found disturbing. His body began shutting down in ways that medicine could not understand. Records describe seizures, periods of apparent death followed by revival, and deterioration. Charles's inability to communicate his final wishes meant that court factions fought over his deathbed. The testament that would determine the Spanish succession was written and rewritten. European powers waited anxiously for news of his death and his will. The ceremonies surrounding Charles's death reflected concern and political theater. Clergy performed rites while officials ensured that protocols were followed.
Queen Mariana's vigil at her husband's bedside represented the final act of a marriage that had never been more than political theater. Her writings revealed relief mixed with sadness for a man whose life had been ruined. She had witnessed the destruction wrought by genetic policy. Diplomats reported scenes that stunned European courts. The dying king of Spain looked more like a corpse that had been artificially animated than a living being. His breathing was irregular, his eyes had lost focus, and his jaw had become distorted. The moment of Charles's death on November 1st, 1700, marked not just the end of his life, but the conclusion of Spanish dominance. The empire would now be carved up among foreign powers. News of the king's death spread rapidly. In Vienna, Paris, and London, government ministers began implementing plans. The death of one man would reshape the balance of power. The irony of Charles II's death was that his testament naming Philip of Anjou as his successor ensured that the Spanish throne would pass to the French Bourbon dynasty. The genetic catastrophe delivered Spain's empire to their enemies, completing the cycle of destruction. The aftermath of Charles II's death revealed the full extent of the damage inflicted by Habsburg inbreeding. Spain became a secondary player in politics. The empire's territories gained independently, while possessions were traded. The War of Spanish Succession consumed Europe. The conflict toll exceeded anything Charles could have imagined, making his genetic tragedy a catalyst for warfare. Analysis of the Habsburg family tree reveals the horror of what observers could only describe in superstitious terms. The coefficient of inbreeding in Charles II's lineage exceeded that found in mice, making his survival a biological miracle. The territories were partitioned among powers, with France gaining control of Spain, while Austria received Italy. The British Empire expanded into former Spanish territories, while colonial empires filled gaps. The artistic treasures were scattered. The Spanish Inquisition disbanded as the political power evaporated. The institution that had burned heretics found itself powerless to prevent the collapse. The tragedy of Charles's life extended beyond his suffering to encompass the lives disrupted by the collapse of Spanish power. Colonial populations faced instability, while European communities found themselves abandoned. The scientific lessons of the catastrophe would not be understood, as the mechanisms of heredity remain mysterious. The family left behind a legacy that would inform research for generations to come. The assessment of Charles's reign must